Sonia Goodman is a famous member of the Russian Orthodox Church and the community in London. She's the daughter of a Russian immigrant, and we're going to talk to her about her life.
So if you were to use one sentence to introduce yourself, what would you say?
Well, I'd say that I was the first generation of my family to be born in England.
Can you say what family you were born in?
Babu's father was the Duke of Mecklenburg-Strelitz. Yeah, and they were part of the Romanoff family.
Do you have a particular sort of most memorable pre-revolutionary family story?
My father's aunt had married Swedish Finns, so they had an estate in Finland. My grandparents spent quite a lot of time at that place. They used to arrive at in Tsarskoye Selo, and they'd leave their hats on all the statuettes. In the station, there was quite a big hall. They had concerts there. In the winter they'd go to St. Petersburg, and they had the palace, which is now the Russian Museum. They all died rather young, those people. I mean, he was 50 years old. They'd have heart attacks. They all grew to be a bit too fat. They weren't married then at all, because my father was much younger than my mother. I mean, my mother was part of the royal family in a way in Russia. He was lucky in that way, because he wasn't lucky on the whole in life. But he went to the lycée. Well, it was a sort of equivalent of Eden and in Russia, and it had been started by Alexander I. That's why he spoke English very well, and he spoke French, of course, and Russian, and German pretty badly. His father had been murdered up in the Caucasus, because they'd gone communist up there. When the whites would take it again, his cousin got him out and sent him to Finland, to his aunt there. That's really how he was saved.
Why was the UK? Why was England?
Well, the UK was because my father, whose father had been murdered by communists and that, wanted to join the British Army, a section of it, which was going up into the north of Russia.
Arhangelsk.
Yeah. And when he got to London, finally, he managed to hitch a ride on a destroyer going to Tilbury. He was told by the War Office that they didn't take chaps who were lame, and he was lame from birth. He was looking for work because they wouldn't have him in the British Army. My mother was 7 years older than my father, and they only really got married in London. They had a very nice house just above Lord's Cricket Ground. The town was really divided in a funny way. You'd get quite a smart street or two in London somewhere, in St. John's Wood or somewhere, and then next door would be a slum. That's what happened in St. John's Wood at that time. She had a very good time in London. She would be in the sort of front of the house, and they would be running the financial and the business side, and she would bring friends, and when she ran out of money, she'd go and take another pearl off the necklace. Yes, she had 2 children and nanny. My brother had to go to prep school, and then he had to go to, he went to Brighton College. She bought for £1,000 a house in Golders Green. I was born in London in St John's Wood, 1930, yeah.
So what are your first and most vivid childhood memories?
Painting walls and being nobody bothering. Sonia's with a sort of large paste brush having a go, sitting on the staircase. At first, she was living in Frogmore when George V was still alive, and he would come along and take her out, and then we weren't allowed out on the lawn to play. So I always remember standing at the windows of the house and watching them poking at the tadpoles. It was sort of their childish amusement. She was the favourite cousin of George V, and so he popped her in the house of the head of the park at Windsor. My father really became a sort of loco parentis of them. He was trying to run a record business or something, which I should have never done. Anyway, they were always running out of money, and then he would shout, "Send for the count."
So you mentioned there were much fewer of the sort of white Russian emigres in London. So did that mean that the community sort of naturally integrated more, or was there a big emphasis on sort of maintaining Russian culture, language, and
the next generation really integrated into English, depending on actually how intelligent their parents were. Everybody went to Paris. It was much more home to them. London meant crossing the Channel, yes. And generally you had to speak English properly, because in those days nobody spoke anything else in England. The thing that really integrated my family very much more was because my mother spoke perfect English.
How did you learn Russian?
Oh, I learned Russian because my nanny never learned English. That's why I speak Russian, and it's also why I can't read and write in Russian, because she couldn't. So I had a brother. When the war broke out, he and Natalia's husband went to Shrewsbury and volunteered to join the British Army. He was killed in Holland, and he was a captain. Everybody, when the war broke out, everyone thought that the Germans would sort of bomb everything straight away, you know, and they didn't.
My grandmother's sister,
yeah,
Aunt Cat,
that was awful.
Who they all loved so much. She was killed in a bomb direct hit on a bus, wasn't she?
In London.
In London, yeah. She had 3 sons who were in the Navy, in the Army, the Air Force, and they all survived. Survived the war, yeah. First we lived in number 4, Cavendish Road, which ended up at Lord's Cricket Ground. That was the first 4 years of my life. We lived in that house, and I painted the walls with paste.
You stayed in London the whole time? You didn't, I guess some children were sent outside?
Yeah, actually we went to Nottinghamshire. Well, we ended up living there, because my father came back to London and said, well, you can't come back because they're bombing every night. And so you'd better stay where you are. And they were delighted because they didn't have to have refugees from Nottingham, you see. Because we were their refugees. And that's where I got it all wrong, because I heard people in the village, you know, there I was a little monkey, you know, about 9 years, 10 years old, and I heard people saying that, oh, but it's terrible, Mrs. McLean is such a snob, and that, and I said, oh no, she isn't. She has the gardener to tea every weekend. And the gardener, of course, turned out to be Lord Charles Cavendish Bent.
He just looked like a gardener.
But, you know, he had patches on all his leather. The Russian church was always, yes, that was the sort of centre. I was taken to church by my father really every Sunday. We had a wonderful priest. He'd go round the shops in North End Road and see what he could forage. And then that appeared on the table after church. He'd criticised what the British government were doing by being in cahoots with the Russians.
St. John of Shanghai and San Francisco, who became a...
He came to London, yes. And I used to find that rather terrifying, because he wore some sort of a box round his neck or something under his whatever the top garment's called. I don't know. It is part of the Russian church in a way, that way of self...
it was like wearing chains or something,
Yeah.
something to make life harder for himself.
Yeah. My father brought him home to spend the evening with us, and then he walked him back to the station and put him on the underground to go back to Baron's Court or where he was staying. And next day, the man who took the tickets as you left, he said, oh, that was a wonderful man you had with you yesterday. My Orthodox faith is, of course, very important to me. It's the basis. It's so mixed up with my non-church, if you like, that it's all sort of goes into one.
Do you see any role for sort of Russian emigres in Russia and its future?
I'm afraid that I don't really see any future in Russia.
What's your secret of a happy life?
To have children in a reasonably moral way, and bring them up to have the same values as we did.
Thank you very much for taking
Well, thank you.
Well done, Mama.
Hi.
Yeah, job. You did really well. I couldn't believe how much you remembered.
That was
That's
just
fantastic.
a rehearsal.
No, don't play the real thing.
Yeah.
This is the real thing now.